Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here and welcome to my latest video. And today we're going to be covering something a little different, as you might have guessed by the title. Rather than going in depth on the player history of the game, we're going to be taking a look at the backstory of EVE Online, or as it's more commonly known, the lore. And more specifically than that, we're going to be taking a look at the ongoing storyline which has really captured the zeitgeist of EVE, and that, as you might have guessed, is the Drifter invasion and all the related events that led up to that. However, as the lore of this event is primarily being told through ARG elements, I thought it was important to bring on board someone who knows a lot more about this area of the lore, and more specifically has been involved in that kind of ARG element, in order to explain the details of how everything works to us. And more specifically, I brought on board Ashterothi, who you might remember from one of my previous videos where I introduced him as the person who had first kind of highlighted the Drifter invasion to me. What I didn't mention there is that Ashterothi is also a fairly popular EVE streamer with a focus on lore, PvE, and also helping new players. So if you have more questions as a result of this video, feel free to pop along to it and actually ask him the questions that you have. I'm sure he'll answer to the best of his abilities. Alongside him, I'd like to give a shout out to the Arataka Resource Consortium, as they've been doing a wide degree of in-character news reports on the lore as it's developed over the past couple of months. So if this is something that you're particularly interested in, I'd recommend you take a look at their channel. Anyway, with all that said, I hope you'll join me as we just take a deep dive into the lore, at least as it stands right now. So, Ashterothi, let's go right back to the beginning and take a look at one of the races that I know is going to play into this storyline. Who are the Sleepers, and how did they end up in wormholes to begin with?
Sure. So before we go any further into all of this, I want to stress that a lot of the information that we have that provides these answers are incredibly unreliable. We have two or three sources in the course of the history of the Eve that really tells us a lot about the answer to the question that you're giving right now, but they're not verifiable. They're things like a recording that was left on a Jovian station, or something that one specific Jovian tells to somebody else. Like we only have the words of people that may not even know the truth themselves to go by. That being said, the early Jovian Empire did not collapse in the same way that everyone else did, because they didn't have a civilization yet. When everybody else was using FTL and getting set up and having colonies and supporting Earth and getting support from Earth, the Jove actually needed to travel at sublight speeds in order to get to their home. So the way they did that was they basically loaded all their dudes into a giant arc, or whatever, and put them into suspended animation in order to make them survive the journey. And to entertain them during this journey, they constructed this virtual reality construct that was fairly rudimentary, but allowed them to continue to do experiments, or just basically entertain themselves until they were able to make it to the Heaven constellation and establish the Jovian Empire. Now, this group was known as either the Architects or the Sleepers, depending on who you ask. The Architects because they helped construct the Jovian Empire and kind of functioned as the Jovians' smarty pantses that fixes people's problems. And then, of course, the Sleepers because they spent most of their time in virtual reality, quote unquote, sleeping. So over the course of the two Jovian empires, the Sleepers continued to develop their construct and all that kind of stuff. And they remained some sort of power base within the Jove system, apparently through the collapse of and rebuilding of the empire, right? Because the Sleepers still existed at the end of the Second Jovian Empire. So at the end of the Second Jovian Empire, there was kind of this conflict between the Statics and this other group, basically an argument within the Jove about whether or not they should be rapidly mutating themselves versus trying to stay the same. And the Sleepers kind of represented the Statics. So they didn't do as much biological manipulation. They didn't do any of that kind of stuff. So they were not impacted by the Jovian disease when all of the other Jove were. So when this whole thing happened, they kind of collapsed in on themselves and turned against the Architects. So the Architects had to leave. So they went north, as it were, to where Jove space is now, and that's where they found the star W477 Tech P, which we now know as Caroline Star. And Caroline Star has this giant lattice, Dyson lattice around it, where there's all these power collectors basically that's harnessing the power of this sun. And they're using it, or it was being used by this ancient race known as the Talican, which nobody knows, nobody's seen about. It was ancient even when the Jovians found it, who used this device to literally warp space-time to create what we now know as a Noikis, right? So effectively, it was sort of similar to our Stargate technology, but they did it without Stargates, right? They made just wormholes places because they could, because they had enough energy to punch holes in space-time. Cool. So the issue is that when so then the sleepers find this thing, they use it to go to Anoikis to hide effectively, and when they get to Anoikis, they find the Talican, the remains of the Talican civilization, and they find this intensely interesting, and so they set up their new constructs nearby the Talican wrecks and go to sleep. And they have their automated drones that protect them, et cetera, et cetera. And then at some point after that fact, that's when we see the rise of the Other, which is the rogue AI, the Agent Smith of this matrix, as it were, which apparently wins, subjugates the sleeper race, and basically controls the construct and the sleeper drones and all that other stuff through controlling the infomorphs of the sleepers who are in there. So from there, the Other wants to get out and wants to convince the sleepers that they're sleeping, because one of the theories is that the sleepers have actually forgotten that they're in a virtual reality system. And so in order to kind of shock them awake, the Drifter, or the Other, did a sequence of terrible things. It hitched a ride with Jamil Sorum, which was the Empress of the Amar Empire, and basically possessed her. So her mind contained both her brain, her infomorph, and the the Other, right? And there's actually some chronicles where she's struggling with herself, and it's very interesting. There's a conversation between Venial, and who's a Drove member, and Matashi Reich, who's the head of the SOCT, who scanned Jamil right before she was killed. So he knows the truth. One of the few people that do. Either way, so then as the Other was manipulating her, she took several very important actions. The first was they destroyed the super weapon, the Terran super weapon that they used to like herald Jamil's return by destroying the Elder Fleet. And in doing so, because the super weapon used Isogen 5 as its firing fuel, by throwing the super weapon into the sun, they actually caused the detonation of the Isogen 5 that was collected throughout the universe, which resulted in what we know as the Salian incident, which was the massive explosion that opened up the wormholes.
And you can go and visit the worlds that were affected by that apocalypse, right? The shattered worlds that are scattered around New Eden in the actual game.
Correct, including Salian. So there's something involving Type O suns, the blue suns, that produce this special material known as Isogen 5, which is kind of like kryptonite in the fact that like it has to have the sun to power it. So if you move it out from one of those systems, it rapidly decays and loses its value. So there's these massive caches of this stuff that was pulled together by an unknown force. Probably they accuse the Terrans of it, but there's also evidence that the rogue drones, for some reason, has collected together Isogen 5 into these big stockpiles. So when it all blew up, that caused this massive energy spike to go through the entire universe, basically, which effectively opened up, caused the holes that the Talican created, instead of being controlled, to just start opening and closing randomly now, which is why we have unstable wormholes, right? So then, meanwhile, in W477 TAC P, when that happened, there was this massive coronal event where the sun like spits out this huge amount of energy, because it's the same as everywhere else, right? Like the sun's literally exploded with energy when the Isogen 5 went up. So in the same sort of way, W477 TAC P like had this big energy spike, which kind of lashed out and destroyed a part of the lattice. So at that point, the Jove came to the conclusion that the star was unstable, and they knew it was going to go up eventually. So that's why a lot of the Jove has now left. They've fled. And then, as we know, the sun explodes eventually, causing Caroline Star, which sends an even larger shockwave through the system. And because this one was directly connected to the Talakan conduits, this goes through their epicenters, which are these special wormholes or special systems that basically function as like, if normal Anoikis systems are rooms, these would be like hallways, right? Because like in the middle, there's the thing called the epicenter, which has portals to like all these different other locations that can be open or whatever. So this was the creation of the shattered wormholes, right? So now we have shattered wormholes too. And these shattered wormholes are kind of like the inner systems for this whole infrastructure. So with that happening, the other thing that the other did as Jamil was when the wormholes opened, the Amar sent troops into Anoikis to infiltrate the constructs, and they found the sleepers sleeping, and they basically pulled out the bodies and ripped out the implants and went, hey, we could totally use this for consciousness transfer, and thus made the first Templars, which would be later be known as the Dust Soldiers, right? Now, these first ones were really, really messed up. Like they went crazy. They had visions of this is one of the reasons why we actually know about the construct, is because these Templar soldiers actually had visions of the construct, and they received messages from basically the ghosts of the sleepers that are in their brain.
So what were these ghosts trying to say to the Templars, or what were they trying to get them to do?
Uh, well, we're not 100% sure, but that's where the word 514 comes from, for example. So one of the Templars actually wrote 514 in their blood on a wall.
That's pretty messed up, and from what I remember, they kind of only had these visions after they died and they were transferring consciousness between bodies, right?
Yeah, and it's all stuff in the Templar 1 book where basically towards the end of the book we actually see, like towards the beginning of the book we hear about the idyllic form of the construct, where it's a very paradisio, almost Emerald City-ish, and then towards the end we get an image of the construct as it is now, which is basically on fire with the other kind of running the show. So as I said, the other's been trying to convince the sleepers to turn against the living and to wake up and to fight, to do stuff. And so by having these implants ripped out, he's basically destroying the sleeper civilization. And so this radicalizes what's left of the sleepers, and they respond. And that at that point, the drifter or the other figures out how to allegedly figures out how to control human bodies through the same implants that were being used for the sleepers. And so that's when the drifters start showing up or start being created. So they create these giant hives that are used, and they basically smash open constructs and pulling out all the different bodies from the conclaves, which are the big sleeper like discs that you see in wormhole space.
They're destroying the sleeper conclaves, and what are they doing that for, though? Why are they doing that? If they are trying to wake up the sleepers, then why are they killing the sleepers, or are they not killing the sleepers? What's going on there?
The construct has a rule, a law that was mandated from the very beginning, known as the one body, one mind law, which basically means that in order to exist in the construct, you must have a physical body. This is why they sleep. They don't just inject themselves into the matrix and then call themselves good, right? They have to have a physical body that's being maintained in order to be a valid entity within the construct. This is why the other is such a big violation, because the other has never existed. It has no body. It has no form. It is a violation of the living, effectively. So the other doesn't really care about the sleepers themselves. And there's reason to believe that when the body is pulled apart, it doesn't necessarily kill the sleeper inside. It just abandons them there and makes them into a violation. So it's very possible that, for instance, the circadian seekers or the Autothisian lancers that we see are effectively disembodied sleepers that have been injected into a machine, whereas the drifters are copies of the other. Because we know that these are two different organizations, the sleepers and the drifters. So I think that the other doesn't really care. And so once they had enough power to do it on their own and not use Jamil to do it, they just did it on their own. So they build these hides, they smash open the things, they pull out the bodies, and then they inject a drifter mind into the body. So you can actually see this in the emergent threats trailer. They pull out the body, and then they move it onto this slab, and then this light goes over the body, which at first we didn't understand, but now you can see it, and it looks very much like an entosis link, which, by the way, entosis means that you're injecting your consciousness into the thing that you're entosising. That's how it works. So when they entosis a drifter mind into the body, it animates it.
So they're kind of like Capsuleers, but AI almost in a sense. Then.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. They don't seem to have as much like control over their own body. They basically are just there to pilot their own ships. They don't have voice boxes, which is kind of weird. And there's also this low-level radiation that exists through the body that we got through the drifter autopsy. So we're not 100% sure what these clues mean, but where the Triglavians also have strange radiation, it could point towards some sort of relationship between the two.
So at what point did the drifters leave their interactions with the sleepers and start coming into K-space and interacting with Capsuleers and the Empire?
The explosion of Caroline Star is really when we started to see the Circadian Seekers, which are now Autothisian Lancers. And around that same time, we start to see the sleeper caches. And if you go to the sleeper caches, you'll see that there actually is like basically this locked portal, but then there's this device next to it that seems to be like interacting with the portal in some way. So the theory is that the sleepers, for some reason, over the course of, or at some point, went into known space and started collecting these caches of stuff for whatever reason. And then the drifters, when they were released, went to these caches and cracked them open. And their process of cracking them open is what exposed them to us. So that was like the first tentative signs of the drifters. But then as more of the Jovian systems were failing, we start to see the Jovian observatories begin to decloak, right? And that's interesting. And the Circadian Seekers took a lot of interest in it. But then shortly thereafter, we now see the escalation to the drifters. And the drifters are intensely interested in the Jovian observatories. I would argue that that's probably the thing that they are most interested in. It would appear that they are disassembling the Jovian observatories and taking them back to their home. There is in the center of every hive a thing that is extremely odd that we call the pickup sticks, which basically exists in this giant vortex of energy that you can see if you look up or down. But it's this massive array of just these long black shards of metal that originally, when they were introduced into the game, we found 4 different copies of the files that basically over time align these sticks into a tube or gate-like configuration. But that part of the story has never actually progressed. All we know is that as the drifters have interacted with the Jovian observatories have slowly been ripped apart until now they are basically offline.
So a little after this point, we start to see the Triglavians kind of enter the picture, and that's a race that we've never seen before. And they also seem to hate the drifters. So do you have any idea what the relationship is there? How did they come into contact, and what's been going on?
Right. There's a lot of questions. Like we are reasonably sure that we know who the drifters are. And the reason why is because the drifters say, like in the description of the drifters, it says, emerging from the ruins of the sleepers' civilization, da 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 da. And really, there's only 1 or 2 groups that could be coming from the ruins of the sleeper civilization. And as I said, I believe CCP has confirmed to me that the sleepers and the drifters are 2 different organizations, and therefore they can't be the sleepers, which means they have to basically be the other. right? So we're reasonably sure that the drifters are, in fact, the other. The Triglavians, however, is a much, much more hotly debated topic. We know a lot of things about the Triglavians. We know their attitudes about things. And the reason why is because we've been able to pull their internal data for quite some time. When during the August event, right after Invasion or Abyss came out, during the Into the Abyss, or no, not Secrets of the Abyss invasion event, what happened was you could actually go to the caches and put in data sheets, the red loot that you get, and it would spit out one of these Triglavian data streams, which was a short record of one of their encounters with one of the races that they deal with, either ancient enemy Azdaja, deviant automata, or augmented foreign neurodnia, or hive-linked foreign neurodnia, right? Those are the four groups that you have. And you'll actually see that the data streams are lettered and numbered that way. So like all of the drifter ones are all labeled AEA 1 through 6, right? And so in these records, you see all these really interesting interactions between all these groups as the Triglavians are trying to suss things out about these new things that are entering into the Abyss, or at least that they're running into. We don't actually know if all of the encounters were in the Abyss, but either way, I digress. As far as the drifters go, like as I said, they refer to them as the ancient enemy Azdaja, and there seems to be some sort of recognition that not only do they recognize the drifters for who they are, but they find them abhorrent, right? So this is one of the reasons why we believed that the drifters were originally, or the Triglavians, we originally believed that the Triglavians were the Aheduani, which were the caretakers of the architects, because that would make a lot of sense, right? So if the Aheduani, their basic job was to ensure that the one body, one mind law was maintained, and the drifters are a violation of that, then they would know, or that would like turn them against that. But this doesn't exactly make sense, because the Aheduani didn't go with the sleepers necessarily, and also the Aheduani are credited for all sorts of really weird events throughout time, like for instance, giving the artifacts to the Mimitar, which allowed them to make the Elders, and manipulating events to create the Battle of Athioth, in which the Jovian crushed the Amar, which allowed the Mimitar to rebel. A lot of these different moments in time in which Jove manipulated the course of events, a lot of times it's a credit to the Aheduani. So it gets kind of complicated to try to fit the Triglavians in as the Aheduani, but we don't know. We really don't know. We do know that both the Drifters and the Triglavians have references to the Second Jovian Empire. The Triglavians directly reference things from the Second Jovian Empire in their information, and the Drifters are named the Tyrannoses, which comes from the Tyrants, and the Tyrants were basically the leaders of the Second Jovian Empire. So there's some weird theories about the fact that the other may have actually been created by the Tyrants in order to like maintain their legacy, and so that's what the Triglavians are recognizing. But the short of it is that there is this war that basically happened in the Second Jovian Empire that led to what's known as the Shrouded Days. And it would seem as if that war has now spilled back over into the modern era.
So the ancient war is starting again.
Right. Yes. And there's several ancient wars starting again, actually. At the end of Sine Wave Omega, there's a message sent. Like Sine Wave Alpha and Sine Wave Omega is kind of about this assassination that tried to happen during the Empress's coronation, and kind of cited some of the side effects of that, and then also about the release of the Alpha clones and how that technology all happened with the Sisters of Eve and all that kind of stuff. So it's these two chronicles that kind of talk about this stuff. And then at the very end, there's this letter that's allegedly from like the group that was doing the assassination to the people that are trying to figure it out. And it's more or less congratulating them on thwarting their plan, but you're never going to stop us, blah, ha, ha. And then the final line is, did you really believe that the War of a Million Lies was over? which was a very interesting thing to say, given the fact that the only time that we've ever heard of the phrase "War of a Million Lies" was in Inheritance when Venial and Matashi Reich are talking. They refer to the War of a Million Lies, but they say it as the war that happened, like the shadow war that happened within the Third Jovian Empire, in which the SOCT kind of went from being this religious cult to being almost like a shadow government for the Jove. And like there's a lot of power plays at that time. So there's this War of a Million Lies, which was apparently this like struggle for power within the Third Jovian Empire that apparently is not over. And there are a lot of entities, including the SOCT, the SOE, Thuckers, etc., that appear to be playing out this conflict.
Yeah, and I think that one of the more interesting things about the SOCT is that they seem to be the last remnants of the actual Jovian Empire in, modern New Eden. We've not heard from the Jovians, and they were considered the replacement for in the council.
Correct. So you have the Jovian Directorate, which is basically runs the Third Jovian Empire, and then you have the SOCT. The SOCT, Society of Conscious Thought, was this pseudo-religious order that, as I said, it rose up during the Third Jovian Empire, and then eventually like took over the Third Jovian Empire during a time of struggle, and then like there was some things, and then over time, once the Jove started contacting the rest of the races, they SOCT actually moved into the space of the other empires and set up colleges, basically. So they're centers of learning. And so over time, the SOCT was stopped being 100% Jove and eventually kind of transitioned to being a Jovian-led, but all different races kind of institution. So when the Jove effectively stopped talking to us, I think their last message to us was at the end of Sancha incursions, because Sancha actually broke into Jove space in order to make their attacks. So our final message from the director, as far as I know, was to tell us that Sancha has been defeated and been kicked out of Jove space. Then we haven't heard anything else from them, but we know that that's because they all ran away. So in Inheritance, we get explained that there's less than 100 Jovian left. They're scattered throughout the galaxy, hiding. And Venial, who is the Jovian head of the SOCD, basically, effectively hands over the rights and authority of the Jovian Empire to the SOCT. That's why the chronicle is called Inheritance. So it's kind of like if you've ever seen like Stargate, not to spoil anything, but like there's a race that eventually decides to like give another race their legacy and their power, kind of like that. But what it does in the practical is it puts Matashi Reich, who is the head of the SOCT, who is a capsuleer, who is one of the only people that knows the secrets behind Jamil and understands who the drifters are. He is now on the inner council of Concord.
So recently we saw a major kind of change in the behaviour of those drifters, though. Rather than going after the Sleepers and the Jovian Empire, they started to attack Capsuleers. And unlike the Triglavians, they didn't actually send out a declaration of war that explained why they wanted to attack us or that they were in fact going to. Why do you think caused this, or can you speculate on that at all? Alright, so we saw a massive escalation of the Drifter invasions, and unlike with the Triglavian invasions, there wasn't a declaration of war, there wasn't a here's why we're attacking you. Do you have any insight into why the Drifters would be attacking the Capsuleers?
So I don't believe that the Triglavians are attacking us to destroy us. At no point have they demonstrated a hatred for the Capsuleers. They've even said that they want us to join them. They've said things like, actually, they're literally the last thing that the Triglavians have said to us is, you will join the flow or be extirpated. And the flow seems to be like their philosophy or their destiny, or there's this grander thing of the flow of Viraj, which is both probably like the abyss itself and then also like the Triglavian acceptable culture. So it's like, you will join us and our quest and what we're doing, or we will kill you. So the whole thing is with the Triglavians is that they are testing us. They want to know more about us. They want to know how strong we are, how capable we are, and what we are capable of, what side we will take part in. Like they know that they don't like the Sancha. They know that they don't like the Drifters. They aren't sure about the road drones. There are some of them that believe that they could be useful. Some of them believe that they are just a problem. But specifically, Capsuleers seem to interest them incredibly, and so they're trying to test us. That's why you see things like proving grounds, including the World Art Proving Ground. It's why when the Zoria shows up, it says they issue you a formal challenge. Like they're not necessarily here to just kill us. They're here to test us and to test their own capabilities of mutating space-time. So that being said, the Drifters, far more mysterious. As I said, they have no voice boxes, so it would be very difficult for them to communicate even if they wanted to. But they have never, in the history of our time, ever demonstrated any desire to communicate, with one mild exception, which is that they might have used the identity of Highland Tukos to try to get us to bring them body parts. But other than that, like, there has not been any, there's no negotiation, there's no demands or anything like that. So the question is, why are the Drifters attacking Nullsec? So there's two pieces to this theory. The first piece is when the Drifters attacked Arataka Research Consortium in Semiki, which is a high-sec system, several months ago. At the end of that conflict, Concord shows up and said that they were deploying anti-drifter technology. So it's very possible that Concord has a capability of preventing these drifter attacks for some reason. Because Concord has been doing these weird studies and research on space-time themselves, especially since the drifters have shown up. So that could very well be why the drifters cannot attack high-sec and low-sec in the same capability that they can attack null-sec. Why now? I think that as they are ancient enemies, they both want to destroy each other. The drifters have been trying to break free, which is why they did things like open up the wormholes and then invade into this, like start investigating this place, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that the Triglavians weren't able to come here very easily or in very much force up until now. And so I believe that the Triglavians demonstrating that power and now physically entering into K-space represents a level of danger to the other that he hasn't previously dealt with. Because as long as it's it's the same as any null-sec group, right? Like, as long as you're invading your enemy and you're just harassing them, then it's fun and games. But as soon as your enemy drops like a bunch of caps into your home, you start getting nervous, right? So effectively, the Triglavians have demonstrated the ability to enter into K-space, which has ramped up the drifters' timeline effectively, which has caused this evasion.
I actually have some rampant speculation that I'd like to put in here, if that's okay. So you mentioned the Triglavians trying to test and, potentially even ally with Capsuleers and the Empires by testing them to see if they're worthy or not. And in previous trailers, like for example The Prophecy, we'd seen that the null-sec empires are canonically the most militarily powerful forces in New Eden to some extent. Do you think it's possible that the Drifters are attempting to deny the Triglavians their most potentially powerful Empyrean allies?
I mean, yeah, it's very possible. It could also be that, so they've been collecting our corpses for quite some time, and Empyreans have the implant systems that are similar to sleepers. So it could be possible. One of the theories is that the reason why they're collecting our corpses is because they're using our corpses to make more drifters. So if they're escalating things, butchering a whole bunch of Empyreans is a really good way to, rapidly grow your forces, as it were. Although at the same time, the drifters have not been seen scooping corpses in the invasion, so I don't know how much that factors through.
So we're kind of reaching the end of what we really know here in terms of the storyline as it's progressed so far. But there is a third race that we should mention along with the Triglavians and the Drifters, and that's their Sancha. And given that the Sancha also break the one mind, one body rule, by having one mind but many bodies, do you think that it's likely that we'll see Sancha get involved at all, attacking low-sec or wormholes or some other area of the game?
They actually don't like Sancha for a slightly different reason. They don't like hivelinks in general, but there is one of the data streams talks about this Trioka, which is, I believe, a military a military organizational term for them. Either way, I digress. So effectively, this ship, Gitz of the Veles clad, encounters the Sancha, and the Sancha corrupts one of them, one of the 3 crew members of this ship, because of course they have 3 crew members. And this corruption was considered such a threat that they decided to immolate the ship. And there are talks of corruption throughout, possibly within the clades. So it's very possible that Sancha is actually actively trying to capture and take over Triglavian minds as well, which is why they think it's such a huge threat. It's the hiveling nature of it is bad. The corrupted nature of it, the fact that it's mind control, that is the thing that they are really freaking out about. And so much so that they've actually, we have Zoria Triglav, which is it's just the Trioka that's basically assigned to known space. But then there's actually a second Trioka, or whatever. There's a second guy who's specifically from the Svarog Clod that is effectively assigned to the destruction of the Sancha, which is why when Semiki was attacked by Sancha 2 days ago, that Uriel used a Svarog Clod communications link to call for help from the Triglavians. Now, the Triglavians did show up, but they didn't seem to actually fight the Sancha. They actually seemed to help the Sancha, and then the Sancha ran away. We're not 100% sure why that was, but in the end, the Drifters also showed up, and then the Sancha and the Drifters did fight, and the Drifters blew up the Sancha. So we learned that the Drifters and the Sancha are also not working together, which is something that I thought was happening before. So yeah, I think that there definitely is this serious war going on. Obviously, this is chapter 1. There is a lot of suspicion that chapter 2 is going to be more Drifter focused, or chapter 3 is going to be more Sancha focused, which puts it online. If they're going to add Project Nova into all of this eventually, that puts the timeline correct, right? So if you think of chapter 3 as being maybe next spring, then that would be the perfect time for that plot to kind of be ramping up for Project Nova, right? So what I think is going to happen is that the Drifters are going to become more and more of a threat to the Empyreans, and that the Triglavians will eventually establish communication and provide us the tools to stop them. For example, one of the last messages that we received, we got the message from Zoria Triglav that was played at Eve North, but we also received a second message in that email, and it contained an image or a video of a structure, what looks like a structure that we've never seen before. So what I'm thinking is that if we do get some sort of observatories or some sort of device to detect the Drifters, it'll come from the Triglavians. So imagine if they knock out local, for instance, and then the Triglavians offer up some sort of observation tower based on the old Jovian observation posts that allows us to not only now detect Drifters, but also reestablish local, for instance, just as an example.
Well, as a member of the CSM, I couldn't possibly comment on any of those ideas, but it's been wonderful talking to you, Ashterothi, and thank you so much for spending the time to come here and, provide this interview to send out to the public. I hope we'll have the chance to talk again soon, but until then, don't forget everyone, fly smart.